Hi guys, it's Debbie, and it's finally that time of the month in which I give you a recap about everything I've watched, giving you some suggestions about good films or series I would recommend. As always, I would like to thank everybody who sent in their suggestions. You'll see quite a few on today's list, and if you have any other ideas, let me know with a comment down below. Also in the comments, I would like to hear what you've been watching, what you enjoyed, what you wouldn't recommend, what you think about the titles I'm about to speak about. Let me know everything. This episode actually covers 2 months compared to my usual monthly installment because this summer has been a bit tricky time-wise, so everything will be summed up here. And now let's jump right into the list, which I would like to open by speaking about the 2 films I enjoyed watching the most this month. And if you're curious about Tenet, it will come later on in this video. The first film, which took me completely by surprise, but which I loved, was Bustersmile, starring Rami Malek. I have no idea why I'd never watched this film. It was fascinating, the cinematography was dazzling, the depiction of the protagonist's personality was incredible. I felt lost within his far-fetched world, and I couldn't stop thinking about it the whole day. I read a description which outlined it as, quote, weirdly wonderful and wonderfully weird, and I couldn't agree more. Rami Malek portrays an average man struggling to make ends meet. He works endless night shifts, trying to make money and time for his family. I really don't know how to say the rest without spoilers, but let's say that his protagonist soon starts to embrace a new vision of the world, and the way he lives and the events that occur around him begin to change in a very, very unexpected way. I'm not going to say anything more. The next film I enjoyed watching the most was one of the few Italian-American mobster films I still had to see, and that is A Bronx Tale, Robert De Niro's first film as a director. I didn't even know what this film was about. I hadn't seen any trailers. It was just always recommended alongside great films such as Goodfellas or The Godfather. In reality, this film surprises viewers because although it is set in your typical neighborhood mafia environment, with the local boss taking care of the young protagonist and all the issues of being involved with criminals, such as having to choose between sticking with your family and what is right, or taking advantage of the privileges of the criminal underworld, it also explores a completely different storyline. Now, after watching A Bronx Tale, I looked up the trailers and I noticed that that part of the story is never mentioned, so I'm going to do the same to not spoil it. Anyway, it was interesting to see a film like this, but with Robert De Niro outside the role of the mobster, on the contrary trying to keep his son away from that world. And I must say, Lillo Brancato, who portrays his son, definitely looks like him and like somebody who would live with him all day long. And then one of my favourite aspects of the film was the soundtrack, with some really emotional pieces set on the background of emotion-fueled scenes. I'm so pleased I finally got to watch it. This month I actually watched other 2 films starring Robert De Niro. The first one was This Boy's Life, which had been on my watch list for a while because it's basically Leonardo DiCaprio's first big film, and apparently the one that led to his much future recurring collaboration with Martin Scorsese. This Boy's Life portrays the story of a dysfunctional family unit, a mother and son who don't have anyone in their life. They live a pretty nomadic living until they meet a new potential husband and father who is seemingly perfect, but who also hides a pretty rough personality. This film doesn't have a mind-blowing story in terms of plot twists, but it has a pretty impressive depiction of the characters' personalities, and there's a great chemistry between De Niro and DiCaprio. The other De Niro film I watched is Cape Fear, with a remarkably frightening villain. This is not a horror movie, but I must admit I felt more intimidated by De Niro's character here compared to some other straightforward, scary films. De Niro portrays an ex-convict who, once released from prison, begins to stalk his former lawyer, his family, and especially his daughter. So the story is all a taunting game of cat and mouse, of psychological terror, and trust me, De Niro is terrifying. Next up, I watched Freedomland, starring Julianne Moore and Samuel L. Jackson. This film had a great potential. At first, it felt similar to a Mystic River investigative style of narration, with all the dodgy characters and various contrasting storylines which don't seem to add up. But it somehow never reached that. Julianne Moore portrays a mother who reports her son missing to the police, and her case is then followed by Samuel L. Jackson's character. But of course, the more the police investigate, the more loose ends come up, the more contrasting information they receive and find. As I was saying, I was really hoping for something more. It was still gripping, but it decided to focus all its energy on completely different aspects, for example, the overacting in some scenes. I then watched a film from which I wasn't expecting much, just your classic romantic comedy, but with better written dialogues. Some quirky, sad New Yorker millennials. But instead, it hit me right in the feels. I'm speaking about The Big Sick, starring Kumail Nanjiani. In this film, Nanjiani basically portrays himself, his life as a comedian, as well as his love/hate relationship with the strong Pakistani culture he belongs to. In particular, it focuses on the family having a very big say in relationships. So when he starts dating a woman with a very different cultural background, things get a little more agitated, especially when she falls ill and the two different lifestyles have to come together in that difficult moment. It's that moment of, okay, we feel different, but we're all stuck in this situation, so we may as well try to get on and try to get to know one another. Again, I was completely expecting this film to be your average, quirky, artsy, cheesy, romantic love story, and in reality, I was so positively surprised. It was definitely recommended. For example, a terrible romantic comedy I watched this month is Remember Me, starring Robert Pattinson, back at the time when he was the most paid heartthrob in the world because he had just been in Twilight, not knowing all the success that would await him many years later. I think Remember Me tried to be the film about romance, but also about struggling in life and hardships and fathers with alcohol problems and strong independent characters who stand up for themselves, but it didn't really work out. Nothing really happens here. The characters are just sad and talk about their sadness, which has its reasons, but nothing really happens beyond that. They have sex, they fight, they complain, they cry, they're sad. That's about it. The film never really goes further, and I think that back at the time, that definitely didn't help Robert Pattinson to leave behind his Edward Cullen phase from Twilight. Luckily, he managed to detach from that, and not long after, he was starring in another film I watched this month, and that is Cosmopolis. Now, when I first started watching this film, I thought, I can't do this, because nothing really makes sense at first. It follows a young billionaire who is traveling across New York in his fancy stretch limo, and he meets various people in his life. Friends, co-workers, lovers, and he has intense conversations with them, but which at first make no sense. The characters just discuss various issues and facts. But as the film moves on, Pattinson's character starts to loosen up a lot. And by the end, you can't believe how all the events turned out to be. I watched these two Robert Pattinson films because Tenet was being released, and I wanted to catch up with a couple more titles of his. Now, before watching Tenet, I actually returned to cinemas during the first days they reopened in Italy after the lockdown. And cinemas were showing all the big titles that would appeal to a larger audience. So there was a selection of all genres, from kids' films like Onward to horrors like Gretel and Hansel. There was 50 Shades Free, etc. And in addition to that, they were showing some big classics. I know some cinemas were actually showing A Clockwork Orange, so films that most of us hadn't seen back at the time. And as it was the 10th anniversary of Inception by Christopher Nolan, the same director of Tenet, with a Tenet featurette, and because I'd never seen Inception in cinemas, I decided to go for that. I've spoken about Inception many times. It's one of my personal favourite films, and it is kind of universally considered one of the best films of all time, or at least a film you should watch before you die, because of the narrative layers within it, the analysis of the characters' subconsciousnesses, especially DiCaprio's, the emotional soundtrack, the practical effects. It's a great film all over. There are very few bad reviews concerning Inception, and most of those bad reviews are saying, well, there's only so much you can put into a film. The story is based on the concept that ideas are the most resilient parasites. So once you have an idea, there's no way really of erasing it. So people have learned how to access ideas from dreams during sleep, when the subconscious can be infiltrated. This means both extracting information or planting new information. Inception is a film I would always recommend. If I ever had to make a compilation of the 10 films to watch before you die, Inception would definitely be on it. Then I finally got to see Tenet after 3 years of waiting since the last Nolan film was released. On my channel there is a full standalone review of Tenet if you want to watch that. I will try to briefly sum it up here, but there is a lot to talk about. In Tenet, the main characters are on a mission against a completely different and unprecedented threat, as the normal flow of certain elements in our life has been inverted. For reasons which I will not explain, This has reached the point of creating a threat which is worse than a nuclear holocaust and which they have to try to stop. Now, in my opinion, Tenet is a very well created film. It has very few flaws, but I also believe that Nolan has spoilt us with his previous films, so we're always expecting something even better from him. So even with a great soundtrack, acting, cinematography, the practical effects, it just never feels enough because of what he has set as a previous baseline. Is it complicated? Yes, very. Do you need to watch it at least twice? Definitely. Now let's take a break from films to speak about a couple of documentaries I watched. July actually opened with a docu-series which in reality is a continuation of an old show from the 80s, Unsolved Mysteries. Now, as the title suggests, this series focuses on real-life unsolved mysteries, from murders to abductions to apparent alien activity, and it covers all the case details, what might have occurred, the possible suspects and leads, what information is still missing, and most of the cases drive you nuts because there must be an explanation even to the most baffling circumstances. Or other times, everybody has a strong feeling who the suspect may be, but there's nothing that will give a definitive closure to the case. If you're looking for some creepy stories, this is definitely a good choice. Also because in the past, this project has sparked some interest because when it aired, people would actually pour in new information because they might recognize something from the scene, and some cases have actually been solved. Right after watching Unsolved Mysteries, I watched another Netflix documentary based on real events, The Trials of Gabriel Fernandez, which I wouldn't describe as creepy, but as brutally depressing. This is the awful story of child abuse ending in the cruel death of a little boy, as well as all the lack of support on behalf of the social workers who were involved in the child's case, the people who saw frightful signs of abuse over the years. It's creepy because if you hear of some of the ideas that the parents came up with to inflict pain upon their child, you temporarily lose faith in any good in the world. And then at the same time, you're thinking this is just one kid out of thousands in the world who are going through the same situation, the same circumstances, and you can see how everything that happened in this particular case was easily avoidable. This is actually one of the few projects which go straight to the point on what child abuse actually looks like, because it's often covered in a vague manner which doesn't really show you what realistically goes on. A similar documentary I watched was Dear Zachary, a suggestion I found on Reddit with users recommending to not look into it, to not watch the trailer, to not read up on the matter. So I did that, and I can understand why. And that's why I can't talk too much about it. The documentary follows the life of an apparently normal family and a series of brutal events that occurred and which tore it apart. And the more you watch, and the more messed up things happen. I'll leave it at that. Now, returning to films, a rather famous title I decided to watch this month was Panic Room by David Fincher, who is actually one of my favourite directors, but for some reason I never bothered watching this movie because, I don't know, the premise didn't particularly appeal to me, and boy was I wrong. In Panic Room, Jodie Foster and Kristen Stewart portray a mother and daughter duo who move into a fancy New York house with all commodities, including a panic room, a safe room where people can conceal personal belongings or can hide themselves without anybody else being able to gain access to that room. It's totally equipped with survival material, and in case of emergencies, people can lock themselves in that room and survive for quite a while waiting for rescue. In this film, the panic room is used because some burglars break into the house and there is a huge standoff between the intruders and the homeowners. So although the film takes place within a very limited setting, it keeps you on edge and biting your nails, even thanks to an ensemble cast which also features Forest Whitaker and a very young Jared Leto. I then watched an awful series. It's a Dutch series called Addis, which I only decided to watch because I'd read some articles describing it as the most frightening title on Netflix at the moment, and people weren't even managed to finish it because it's so creepy and blah blah blah. Now, I will give it some credit for the creepiness. Some scenes are pretty frightening, but the rest is just the ultimate cringe fest. It really looks like somebody took Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut and wanted to give it a more teen drama horror vibe, a little like American Horror Story, but it all went terribly wrong. Briefly summed up, it's the story of a group of students who belong to a society, an association which is more of a cult. At first it appears just like an incredibly fancy and secret club, which has a dangerous appeal to it, but it turns out to be more of an unhealthy association, which also appears to have some ties to the supernatural. But the main problem with this series were the character interactions, which were forced to the point of never feeling credible. And then the whole storytelling just feels like an old Goosebumps book in which every chapter has to end with an insane cliffhanger. If you are looking for a better attempt at creating a similar concept, I would recommend checking out the very first seasons of American Horror Story. Next up, I finally managed to complete a Studio Ghibli film I never watched all the way to the end, and that is Castle in the Sky. Now, to be completely honest with you, the reason why I never watched this film all the way to the end was that I just didn't enjoy it as much as the other Ghibli movies. I know some people absolutely love this film, I just didn't feel particularly engaged by it. The story could be compared to films like Porco Rosso, which has a more action-based storyline. And it speaks of two kids who are always being hunted by the military. So all the way on their long mission, which includes a castle in the sky, they have to avoid being tracked down and caught by the enemy. That was a pretty vague explanation now that I heard it coming out of my mouth, but I think the element that really made me fall in love with Ghibli films back at the time was the cute magic element, if that makes sense. But then, just as I was mentioning with Tenet, when you set a high baseline, you feel you become spoiled and you feel like nothing is ever enough. I also watched another Studio Ghibli film this month called From Up on Poppy Hill, which instead I really enjoyed. Now, a few months ago, I spoke about a film called Columbus, which I could only describe as a really chill, low-key, but beautiful film. And From Up on Poppy Hill also has a similar atmosphere. On the contrary of many famous Ghibli films, which heavily feature magical elements, this movie is very simple, down to earth and profoundly human. Can you say that? And now I realise this is going in contrast to everything I said about Castle in the Sky. For example, one of the most beautiful scenes, it just concerns the characters taking a bite, going into town, grabbing something to eat, chatting. It's very straightforward about relationships and friendships in a very relatable way. The story is that of two high school students who start to develop a crush on each other amidst all the usual school drama and the natural complications of life. Next up, I watched a film which I had already hinted at in my previous video, and that is Love by Gaspar Noé. I had already mentioned this film because up until June I had never experienced a Gaspar Noé film, and then I watched Climax. As I explained in that video, it didn't particularly captivate me, but I had given the experience the benefit of the doubt as I wasn't familiar with the director's works. Now this month I watched Love, which I would definitely recommend not to watch in public spaces or around people who could be easily embarrassed because they're very, very lengthy, explicit sex scenes. I'm speaking of blue is the warmest colour sex scenes. So at first glance, Love is no different from Climax. It appears as a pretentious art film with no objective is not to be unconventional and overreaching. But then as the plot moves on, you realise it's actually pretty realistic and heartbreaking, and although the relationship that is at the core of the film is quite overdramatic, in the end it speaks of themes which are very common in every relationship. Love is basically a collection of everything that could go wrong in a relationship, a very strong relationship, but it shows both points of view on the matter. For example, even the point of view of who could be considered completely wrong or the person who ruins everything. It pushes the boundaries of what we could consider acceptable in a relationship. So although I started my vision with, right, I'm out of here, by the end I might have shed a tear. But do I want to rewatch this film? Not at the moment. Next up, I watched a film about a cow. Yep, a film about a cow called First Cow. The only reason I watched this film is because it's brought to us by a company called A24, who are known to always exceed audiences' expectations with either incredible storylines, unexpected plot twists, or even just a beautiful cinematography. Let's just say that even their most simple films have at least one particular feature that will make them stand out. Some examples of A24 films are The Lighthouse, Lady Bird, Uncut Gems, Midsummer, Hereditary, 8th Grade, First Reformed, even Climax by Gaspar Noé I was speaking about earlier. So you can see why when this wholesome trailer about a group of 19th century men whose life and businesses take a twist when a cow is suddenly brought into a territory, I was expecting anything possible. even that this cow could be a mutant alien. I'm not going to say too much about this film because I want that curiosity to stick with you if you haven't watched it yet. But one thing I can openly speak about is the cinematography, because there were some very beautiful shots. It's one of the features that have been appreciated the most about this film. It really drags you into that lush Oregon forest environment. I also watched another A24 film called The Last Black Man in San Francisco, which instead of being a story about a cow, is the story of a house. It's a very special, old, well-kept house in San Francisco, and the film follows the life of a young man trying to reclaim it, trying to prove that it's his grandfather's, that he would do anything to make it his own, live in it, all of this while other events in his life unfold, family issues, friendships, etc. All of this again with a beautiful cinematography. The protagonist often skates around town, and because of even how the city of San Francisco is made, you often have these beautiful shots. It actually really made me want to visit the city. Next on the list are a couple of titles you guys suggested. The first one was One Cut of the Dead, which had me wheezing out loud in all the moments in which I shouldn't have. The protagonists are the members of a film crew who are involved in the making of a zombie movie, but things on set get totally out of hand and the director just instructs everybody to keep on filming everything. Now the thing is that I don't want to say much more to not spoil the plot. Even if you try to watch the trailer, you will get a huge warning at the beginning of the trailer saying that by watching it, you kind of ruin your viewing experience, so it's up to you. So I won't say anything to be on the safe side. But just imagine a Japanese dark zombie comedy movie which looks like it was filmed in your backyard and which has you laughing out loud and then feeling guilty about it. Sold. Just like that. The other suggestion on your behalf was I Kill Giants, which I'm really pleased I received as a recommendation because I highly doubt I would have found it or picked it on my own. It's the story of a kid whose mission is to kill these huge giants who are a menace to a small town where she lives in a dysfunctional family unit. One of the biggest issues is that she's bullied at school for this mission of hers because she stands out in the crowd for being different, because of her situation at home, economic problems, and the only person who stands by her side against all the rest of the world is this one new girl she befriends at school. This film unexpectedly touches many subjects I wasn't even expecting, from the consequences of bullying, the struggle of fitting in, mental health, economic problems, the dreadful feeling of guilt, and I definitely didn't expect to find myself crying my eyes out by the end. Next up, I voluntarily inflicted pain on myself as I decided to watch a terrible Netflix summer film called Under the Verona Sun. Which comes just after a month from another very similar film with basically even the same actors called Summertime, which I had harshly criticised in one of my previous videos. Under the Verona Sun is basically a teen summer romance comedy film set in Riccione, which is the Jersey Shore of Italy, with nothing much more than nightlife and hotels and clubs and bars and so on. Now the main story wasn't too bad. It covered this friendship between two guys who each struggling with their own issues. For example, one of them really struggles with making relationships, with meeting new girls and expressing himself with them, while the other, who is blind, is struggling to feel included because of his disability. For example, the concept of telling a date that he is blind, while also feeling overwhelmed by his mother, who doesn't let go of the idea of him as her little boy. The main problem were all the other characters who had absolutely no interest in personality traits except being spoiled and annoying. Their dialogues were appalling, and the continuity of the story was butchered to the point that there was no cohesion between even some of the simplest scenes. At one point, even an original song from the Stranger Things soundtrack was being played in the background. That's the creativity of this project. If I had to compare it to Summertime was actually a pretty good film, if that's the baseline. Next up, I watched a science fiction film from the 90s called Deep Impact, with which I had many déjà vus, so I think I might have already watched parts of it at some point. Deep Impact introduces the scenario of a huge, deadly asteroid heading towards planet Earth and what the plan for that situation would be, something which I've often questioned myself. As the film correctly proposes, How do we stop an asteroid from impacting on Earth? And if the worst comes to the worst, who do we need to save first? What establishes the parameters of who needs to be saved? So on the one hand, it's your regular disaster movie. On the other hand, it offers some pretty interesting points for discussion. Last month, I then actually got to watch a film which used to be pretty popular, and that is The Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus, which is basically one of Heath Ledger's last films before dying, if not his last ever. This film fits into that early 2000s obsession of playing with CGI as much as possible, but also because of the nature of the film, which I believe is more similar to a theatre play, with the way the characters interact as if they're always putting on a show, the exaggerated production design, the theatrical references themselves. The story follows a group of travelling performers who are moving around London trying to make ends meet with their show, which also allows you to explore your imagination, your subconscious, and make choices about your life based on that. I think the only reason why I didn't enjoy it as much as I should have is because the night I watched it, I felt terribly sick. So going into this film was like taking a psychedelic dive. Around this time, I also watched a couple of Indian films. The first one I watched is actually one of the most popular Indian films of all time, PK, which speaks of an alien who lands on planet Earth and who has to learn how to make it in our society. Now, I'd always underestimated this film because all the promotional material presents it as a simple comedy film about physical comedy, whereas it surprised me with a very unexpected analysis of all the ridiculous things we attach so much importance to in our life, because it takes notions we're used to, such as the concept of money, fashion, religion, out of context and shows them for what they are and creates a lot of well thought out comedy. For example, I wasn't expecting all the parts of the film which discusses about religion. And as an atheist, but who has always been intrigued by beliefs and other people's religions and so on, I found it a pretty deep analysis within its comedy. The other Indian film I watched was a horror, Tumbad, but with which I didn't really feel in tune. It's a horror film about ancient deities and treasures and mysterious locations, but I think this was one of the few times I really felt lost in translation. Maybe because while I was trying to keep track with what was going on in the film, the story was so out of worldly that it was very hard to keep up with everything together. But I guess that was my problem. I should have been more attentive. I know many have enjoyed it, so I might give it another try in the future. After that, I watched a Japanese film called I Want to Eat Your Pancreas. Now, all of those who have watched this film agree that the title makes it appear as something bizarrely comical, but which then offers a completely different story. It's the story of a girl who is diagnosed with a serious, life-threatening disease for which she knows her life expectancy will be very short. So she is trying to enjoy her time and do all the things she wanted to experience while meeting a very special guy in her life. So I would recommend watching this because it is very outspoken about topics such as death that we don't really want to usually speak about. And it totally goes beyond just the title. Next up, I watched a film I'd been meaning to watch for quite a long time because it would always pop up as suggested alongside some of my favourite films, and that is The Cube, which is basically a 90s version of the Saw franchise. In this movie, a group of people are locked inside a huge structure, a maze of connected cubes which are full of all sorts of deadly traps. Just as in the Saw films, for reference, the prisoners have no clue how and why they've been trapped there, no clue how to get out, and they have to figure out their way out of the maze, while also having to deal with the differences amongst the group as well as the natural consequences of exhaustion. So I'm really glad I finally got to watch this film because it's nerve-wracking, but it also asks the viewers to try and figure out a solution themselves, try to figure out what the best way out would be. Right after that, I watched Old Boy, a film I really enjoyed and which is actually a pretty popular Korean film in the West by director Park Chan-wook, of whom I'd already seen The Handmaiden and Stoker. Old Boy is basically the story of a man who was imprisoned for 15 years on behalf of a mysterious taunting person. After being set free, he has to figure out who his captor is, as the torment doesn't stop after he is liberated, so he also has to protect the people close to him. and all of this just escalates beyond expectations. This is a film you need to watch very attentively, because by the end, when everything comes together, you will have wanted to remember everything that happened throughout the film. After that, I watched an animated series called Gretsko, which is incredibly relatable, and while it's cute and hilarious, it's also pretty deep. The characters are all animals, but who live regular lives as humans. They work out, go to the office, deal with relationships, relatives, etc. And the main character is a red panda called Gretsko, who is overworked her accountant job for a huge firm, and who is also navigating the social scene, making new friends, dating, dealing with co-workers and bosses. And although she looks all cute and innocent, she lets off all the steam, all the pressure, by singing death metal songs. She usually does this at a karaoke room, or in the toilet at work, or even just in her head when somebody is annoying her. And although the whole concept may appear at first glance as hilarious and simple, the series actually has a pretty intelligent approach to many topics, from stress on the workplace, the importance we play on our social status, the pressure to find a stable situation, get married, please our family, etc. I watched the first 2 seasons, and the third one came out basically just a few days ago, so if you want to watch it, every episode is 15 minutes max. Next up, I watched another series, this time a British one, starring Michaela Coel, who you might have noticed in other productions such as Star Wars The Last Jedi, Chewing Gum, Black Mirror. The series I watched this month is called I May Destroy You, in which she portrays a young writer, a millennial icon in London, who is just living her life problem-free. But one night, while she's out partying, she blacks out. And as she starts to put the pieces together, she realizes she could have been assaulted. And as she tries to figure everything out, more events unfold. I always found Coel a very good actress, very relatable, very natural, even when she's portraying some very exaggerated features of her characters. And of course, I love to hear in I May Destroy You. And if you're an Italian watching this, it might be curious for you to watch it because Italy is heavily featured in this series. I then watched a couple of Tom Hardy films. The first one was one I'd already watched, but which I rewatched with the family, and that is Venom. Now, I've always liked the character design of Venom, so of course I was really excited when this film came out. I pretty much enjoyed it, but I can definitely see where a lot of criticism towards this film comes from. Mostly because of how the general story is laid out, with not a particular cohesion in the storytelling. Venom is the name of a mysterious, shape-shifting entity which latches onto human bodies and uses them as a host. Only in some cases does this effectively work out, such as with Tom Hardy's character, who finds himself being partially taken over by this alien. It's a fun film, but it definitely shouldn't be watched with a pretentious eye. The other Tom Hardy film I watched instead was one that had been on my watched list for a while, and that is Bronson. Now, Bronson is actually a real-life figure, often called Britain's most violent criminal. And apparently the real Bronson appreciated so much Tom Hardy's rendition of him when they met that he wanted to give him his moustache for Hardy to wear on set. Anyway, Bronson spent most of his years in and out of jail. And this is the story of his life, but made in a nearly theatrical manner, with real events mixed with his imagination and his projection of what is going on around him. This is not one of Tom Hardy's most famous films on a global scale, but it definitely proves once again his acting skills. After that, I watched a film called The Fighter, with a stellar cast with Mark Wahlberg, Christian Bale, Amy Adams, and it portrays the real story of a family involved in the world of professional boxing, but while struggling in their personal lives. For example, Christian Bale's character of a famous boxer is being followed around by a crew from HBO who are creating a documentary about him and about his drug addiction. So there's the past huge international fame, but also all these dodgy personal problems, fighting in the family, having to choose between what pleases others and what you really want, trying to get clean, the influence of those close to you. This film had never really caught my attention, but within minutes, Christian Bale had won me over. He always works his magic in all of his films and with all of his characters. Another film I watched was Game Night, which I think I might have started watching at some time in the past and then I'd given up on. It's basically a comedy about a group of people who particularly enjoy getting competitive at games, whether it may be a board game, a role-playing game, a pub quiz. They get extremely competitive and they've reached the point in which nothing is really enough. They always want something more, something even more competitive and engaging. So one night they all get in together for like a game night when a group of men attack them. They take somebody hostage and they have to figure out whether it's real, whether it's all part of the game. This is not an award winner, it's more a weekend night with your friends on the sofa kind of movie. And now with the last film, we have reached the end of today's list. All the way back from 1997, we have The Rainmaker, starring a very young Matt Damon and Danny DeVito as partners in a law firm. The title alludes to the fact of making so much that it is raining money, hence The Rainmaker. And Danny DeVito portrays the entrepreneur who is always finding new ways to make that cash flow, often closing an eye when it comes to legal implications. While Matt Damon portrays a young lawyer who has just started his career and whose first case is a huge litigation concerning health insurance and a policy which didn't help a young man with leukemia. Now, this is not a gripping film in the sense of nerve-wracking storytelling and incredible plot twists, but it was pretty interesting and it covers a lot of topics which are still very relatable today, 20 years later. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes everything I watched these last 2 months. I was considering whether I should have included the second season of Umbrella Academy, but I just couldn't manage to reach the end. There's nothing more in this second season that's making me want to get to the end. I'm going to quickly quote it here just because I watched nearly all of it, but it's nothing like the first season. If you want to give it a try, the first season it's actually pretty good. It's a mix of grunge and comedy, and it speaks of a group of siblings with special powers who embark on a mission to prevent the end of the world, with a lot of irony along the way. But with that, we have definitely reached the end of the video, the end of today's list. Thank you so much for sticking all the way to the end. I would love to hear your opinion on all the titles I spoke about today. I would love to hear what you've been watching, what you would recommend, what you wouldn't recommend. Let me know everything with a comment down below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you soon in the next one. Bye.